following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. We are back. A long-awaited edition of Golenbock University. I'm Ralph Tyko, and I have the man himself, Peter Golenbock. How are you, sir?
I'm just fine. Thank you, Ralph. Thanks.
Good. We're, as I was saying off air to you, we're going to divert our attention in these harrowing times, both for me watching my state of California burn up little by little, and federally, nationally, we have an absolute crazed cuckoo who's leading us, and it's out of control. We're both very afraid. Am I correct?
You are correct, sir. Yes.
Okay.
He's getting more and more unhinged, unfortunately.
Day to day. And
yep. Day to day.
I always ask my guests if they have some idea of what the ending will be, if they want to predict an end game to all of this, and I'll ask you this, the same thing.
Well, it's going to get ugly. I can tell you that. It's going to get ugly because he does not believe in democracy. He doesn't believe in the Constitution. He doesn't believe in law. And he sees himself as a banana republic dictator. And so he will do everything he can, including, send out his criminals, his Bill Barrs, his Rudy Giulianis, either to subvert democracy in the rest of the world or to do it at home. And,
the Attorney General is an absolute crook. Can you believe a society with that? Unreal.
Well, when you're a crook, I mean, it's like the old mafia gang. It's like the Sopranos. I mean, watching the Trump administration is like watching the Sopranos. It makes for great television. It just scares the hell out of you because you wonder what's going to happen to our democracy.
I said the exact same thing. It's almost 3 years ago when he's elected. I said to Tally, it's going to be great theater. But I had no idea what price glory and how scary it would get. It's interesting, but too close, too real.
I mean, the funny thing is it really doesn't affect your daily life, or it doesn't seem to, except that they seem to be filling the judges, maybe 100, 125 judges, with these people as crazy as he is. And eventually that's going to have a real negative effect on this country. It's a terrible thing.
And what if he loses or wins, loses and decides not to abdicate the throne?
Well, they're going to have to send troops in to drag him out. That's all. That's what they're going to have to do. I mean, there are too many people in this country who care about democracy and who care about this country, including a lot of the former generals who he discarded. They're not going to let this country become a dictatorship. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see how Bouton testifies.
Yeah, it will.
Upcoming week.
It will.
In any event, let's talk a little nostalgia.
Yeah.
The name Jim Bouton came up this week on Facebook. There was a memorial service for Jim. And what struck me is that I read about on Michael Bouton's page. He's the son of Jim. There's a rift between him and Jim's wife when he died, and that struck me as being terrible. Can you shed some light on that?
Yeah, I actually can shed a lot of light on that. But, I'd almost prefer to shed the light on that last. I'd like to sort of start this conversation about how Jim and I met in the first place.
Love to. That'd be great.
And
racing Fiats, I want to hear about that.
Sure. Well, we can certainly
right.
talk about that. In 1972, in the fall, I was working for Prentice Hall in the legal department, writing about President Nixon's wage and price controls. When after 6 weeks, I decided what I really wanted to do was write a sequel to Frank Graham's book, The New York Yankees. And so I went down to the head of their trade book division. His name was Nick Dincheko. And it was a small enough operation that I didn't have to go through secretaries. I didn't have to make an appointment. This was a lunchtime, and I decided sort of on a whim that I would go talk to the head of the trade book division and talk him into giving me a contract to write a book on the Yankees, which would be the sequel to Frank Graham's book. And in fact,
that book would be Dynasty, am I correct?
That book absolutely turned out to be Dynasty. But it was interesting
tell me
because
about
I had
real quick. Tell me about the naming of that book. Did that come naturally, or?
Well, it was always known as the Yankee Dynasty, and that's okay. The name that I wanted to give the book. And in fact, It was interesting because they even allowed me to design the cover. People don't realize it, but that cover is sort of a copy of the cover that was on Frank Graham's book. You know, the
really?
Yankee NY with the blue and white stripes. I think that just epitomized the Yankees, and I thought that would be the perfect cover for this book, and it was. It turned out that way. But the amazing thing, of course, is that I got a contract to do it in the first place. Who walks into a door of the head of a publishing company and talks himself into getting a book contract? But that's exactly what I did.
Moxie. Moxie helps.
It was unbelievable. Fortunately, Mr. Dincheko was a huge Yankee fan himself. I often wonder what would have happened had he been a Red Sox fan or a Milwaukee Braves fan or a San Francisco Giant fan. Would I have gotten my contract? So I got my contract. They gave me $2,000, and I went to Yankee Stadium, where I started doing my research. And after about 3 months of research, I determined that you can't write a book based on newspaper articles, that I would have to go see all the ball players. So I went back to Mr. Dincheko, and I got another $2,000 to go start visiting players, and off I went. And then I got another $2,000, and another $2,000, and another $2,000 for a total of $10,000. I ended up traveling, I think, 27,000 miles, going around the country, tracking down former New York Yankees. And I was helped, of course, because of the fact that Mike Burke was the president of the Yankees at the time, and he wrote me a wonderful letter to these ball players saying that I was doing this book and would these players please cooperate. I mean, what a huge help that was.
Yeah, so, the owner of the team writes an introduction letter.
Right.
That's a big step up.
Pretty spectacular. And so one of the last people I went to interview was Jim Bouton, who lived in Englewood, New Jersey. I was living in New York City at the time at the Penn Garden Hotel, where I had a business where I was renting out hotel rooms to students, a business that would soon disappear. So I drove out to Jim's house, and we started talking, and I interviewed him about Ball 4 and certainly how Ball 4 came into being. You know, Ball 4, if you really think about it, there are two really essential books if you're going to be a baseball aficionado or scholar. The first one was The Glory of Their Times, which I think was written in 1966, and that was by Larry Ritter, who was also a friend of mine. I got to meet Larry. And then Jim, who wrote Ball 4, I believe, in 1969, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 70. And you know, we started talking about how that came about, and he was telling me about the things that he was seeing while he was a player, and talking about the fact that he was criticized terribly for saying that Mickey Mantle was on the top of the Shoreham Hotel with the binoculars, looking at into hotel rooms of stewardesses. And Jim was saying, this criticism was really unfair because what he was saying was that we were doing it, that Mickey and I were doing it together, that it wasn't Mickey, it was the two of us and others as well,
right.
Which is, I guess that's fair.
He was more than criticized. He was ostracized from the
Yes, he certainly was. Yeah, he was ostracized. But it was interesting because he was always, a guy, he was not sitting in the dugout reading the sporting news. He was reading newspapers, right, or he was reading books. And unlike the other ball players who, for the most part, ignored the reporters or pretty much didn't like them, Jim was a real favorite of the writers. Whenever the writers needed somebody to go to for a quote, Jim was always available. He liked these guys. In fact, when he wrote Ball 4, he chose as his sort of writing partner a fellow by the name of Lenny Schechter. Lenny Schechter.
Great.
Lenny Schechter, yeah. who was
From
probably the most critical writer of the ball players. And Schechter was somebody who was really sort of hated by the rest of the Yankee players. So, when they found out that Schechter was the guy he was writing it with, that didn't make them very happy either.
Schechter had written Jocks.
Yeah, the Jocks. Right.
Kind of an expose on the style of baseball.
Yep. Yeah. It wasn't. It was a very good book, though. It didn't sell all that well. I mean, most sports writers didn't have big sales, but certainly when he wrote Ball 4, I mean that hit the sports world like a bomb. Yeah.
And as did yours, by the way.
Yeah,
as
did the Bronx Zoo as well later on.
Yeah.
But so I went to see Jim, and we talked about his career with the Yankees. He told me all about what it was like as the Yankee dynasty came to an end. I mean, he had two really spectacular seasons. He had one season where he was 21-7, and he became the Bulldog. This was, I believe, 62. He had this spectacular year. Helped take the team to the World Series. Then he had another year where he won 18. I think it was 18-13. It may have been 63. And then he sort of hurt his arm. And at that point, his career started going downhill. And at the same time, as he was telling me, the owners, Topping and Webb, were selling the team to CBS. And CBS didn't realize it, but Topping and Webb for several years had stopped spending any money on the farm system. And so when Mantle and Maris and Kubek and Richardson and some of these other guys got hurt, by 1966, the team was in last place. And he was telling me, just how difficult that was, talking about, well, he talked about in great detail the incident where Yogi was the manager in 64, and Joe Pepitone was playing the harmonica. Sorry. Phil Linz was playing the harmonica, and Joe Pepitone, after Yogi told him to put that damn thing away, Linz said to Pepitone, what did he say? And Pepitone said, play it louder. And so a big brouhaha, it was sort of ugly.
It's Yogi off terrifically.
Yeah, and the sad thing, of course, was that Ralph Tyko, who was the general manager at the time, had really, for some reason, had no love lost for Yogi. Yogi had played 20 years as a catcher, and Houck had to sit on the bench behind him all those years, and I guess there was some resentment there. But at any rate, Houck decided in August, when the Yankees were not in first place, that he was going to get a new manager. And so he reached out to St. Louis where the manager over there, St. Louis also was not in first place at the time. Help me out here with the name of the manager, if you would.
Johnny Keane.
Johnny Keane, yes. Okay, so they hire Johnny Keane without telling anybody, and Yogi goes and wins the pennant. And what an embarrassing situation for both the Yankees and the Cardinals, because the Yankees end up playing the Cardinals in the World Series, and at the end of the World Series, Yogi is fired and Johnny Keane becomes the manager. And Bouton had no problem at all telling me how much the players really hated playing for Johnny Keane, how he was something of a martinet, and he was always checking on them to make sure they got their rest, and they just thought he was an old grandpa ninny, and they didn't play for him. And, of course, we know what the story was. The Yankee dynasty, in part because Keane was the manager, came to an end.
I think about that, and what the three pitchers they had, and Stottlemyre and Peterson, and
Al Downing.
Al Downing, yes. They should have not gone down the tubes that quickly. Jake Gibbs did not develop the way they should have. He should have.
Mel Stottlemyre came up in '64 to bolster their team and help them win. Stottlemyre was a big part of that.
Right.
I mean, they just didn't have enough depth. Yeah.
And injuries, like Bobby Richardson was forced to retire because, it was Kubek that was forced to retire.
Yep.
Bobby Richardson retired healthy, but much earlier than anticipated. And that, you lose your double play combination, and you don't have Casey Stengel on the bench to bring in Gil McDougall.
Well, the Yankee fans were not used to a team that was in last place. They just weren't used to it at all. And unfortunately, CBS was the made to be the bad guy in all of this, though it wasn't really their fault. At the time, there was no free agency. And so it took a while for the Yankees to build themselves back up. And it was only after Steinbrenner ended up buying the Yankees from CBS. That's a whole other story. That they ended up winning again. But what happened was, after writing Dynasty, I went to work for the Bergen Record, and then I got a call from Billy Martin, would I write his book? And I said yes, of course. And then I got a call from the same agent saying that Billy couldn't do it, and so would you write a book with this other client of mine whose name was Sparky Lyle? And I didn't really want to do that at first because I sort of thought to myself, who'd be interested in what Sparky had to say? But the short story of it was I went down and I hung out with him, and I saw this could be an absolutely fabulous book if Sparky was a journalist and sort of kept me apprised of what was going on, which he did. And the book became unbelievably successful. And I bought a 14-room house in Englewood, New Jersey, 3 blocks from Jim Bouton.
Whoa.
And that's when we really, really became very, very close friends. I would
14
babysit.
rooms.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep.
Did you?
I would.
I'm just
yep.
curious. Did you furnish them all? Did you?
Slowly, but yeah, slowly. Slowly.
Whoa.
Yeah.
See, that's everybody has the idea when an author has a big hit, a big bestseller. That's all they do for the rest of their lives, and the world comes to them. You mentioned those words.
What you don't realize.
I got a job at the You didn't have. You weren't able to just retire on your.
On Dynasty,
winnings.
I made very little money on Dynasty. I made very little money on most of my books. The Bronx Zoo was a huge exception, and I was sort of blinded to think that this is something that would happen often. I've been lucky. I've had 10 New York Times bestsellers, but none of them were like the Bronx Zoo. None of them. But
right.
So anyhow, let's get back to Jim Bouton.
I would have thought none of them were like Dynasty. I didn't know that you did better on Bronx than you did at Dynasty.
Well, see, Dynasty, when this is off the subject of Bouton, but when you're a first-time author, the publishing company put clauses in there to make sure they get all the money and you don't.
I get it.
Yeah.
I get it. That's it's like a patent in the farms have a big pharmacy patent.
Right. The answer is, the first one goes to them, and then you should be smart enough to hire a lawyer so that that doesn't happen again.
Yes.
The publisher says to you, trust me, and then steals all your money. At any rate.
World.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm living in Englewood, and Jim was, as I said, 3 blocks away. A 3-minute car ride over to his house, and he had 3 little kids. He and his wife Bobby, who was this lovely, lovely woman who he married, and had been his wife for quite a while. He had.
And they adopted these children, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think. I think they all 3 were adopted. Am I correct?
I'm not sure about Lori. Lori might have been their child, but
okay.
Certainly David was. David was from Korea. David ended up becoming a banker. Michael, lovely kid, just a great kid, and Lori, who I call Twink, who was this devilish little girl. She was 7 or 8. She was just like her old man, and she was the apple of his eye, absolutely the apple of his eye. And I would come over and babysit for these kids while they went off. Meanwhile, Jim played on the CBS All-Star team, and he invited me to come and join the CBS All-Star softball team, and I played 6 years with CBS. We would travel all over the metropolitan New York area and play fire departments and industrial teams, and we played for charity and had the time of my life. It was just terrific. Jim was involved in he was a newscaster on CBS, and then later he went to ABC to become their sportscaster on CBS as well.
He was the inventor of the chewing gum thing.
That came later.
Okay. And
that came when he was with the Portland Mavericks. He and one of his buddies from the Portland Mavericks came up with the idea of putting kids' chewing gum in a tobacco pouch and selling it as Big League Chew. And the idea was bought by Phil Wrigley and Wrigley Chewing Gum. And so that gave Jim a nice annuity. It was very good money. Because at the time, ball players weren't making that much money. They really weren't. But Jim was making a nice salary as a sportscaster. And every once in a while, I go into New York and sit there while he was doing his thing and watch him sportscast. He also was the producer of a short-lived TV show, a weekly TV show, which was about a baseball team. It was fun to watch him work on that. And a couple of times he and I and our families and his families, we'd go to Saturday Night Live and watch, that wonderful group of people from Saturday Night Live.
My God, Gilda Radner and
they were all wonderful. So we were really, really close. So one of the things that happened after I wrote Dynasty and I went to work for the Bergen Record is that Jim worked his way back to the major leagues pitching for the Atlanta Braves. He had developed a knuckleball, which apparently was pretty good, enough so that he could be a major leaguer again. And he invited me to fly down to Atlanta from Englewood to watch him pitch. The only catch was that what he wanted me to do is to sit next to this girlfriend of his, whose name was Paula, and pretend that she was with me and not with him.
Oh, the beard.
Ah, the beard. So I did that. We were so close. He wanted me to do that. He had girlfriends. A lot of Major League ball players have girlfriends. I didn't really think anything much of it, and so I did that. And I came home, and it turned out, of course, that he ended up marrying her and divorcing this woman who was so wonderful, this Bobby, his wife Bobby, who was a lovely, lovely person who I had somehow stabbed in the back by doing this. And of course she found out about it, which was horrible. And once Paula came into the picture, she was a very strong presence. She was a psychologist who had certain ideas of how to live life. And part of her ideas was that she and Jim were going to live their life without their kids. And so, fairly soon, she didn't like the way Lori was living her life and had her banned from the house. And then she made up a couple things about Michael, had him banned from the house. And then truly, truly terrible, terrible thing happened. While they were living in Englewood, Lori, who was about 17 or 18 at the time, was driving, and she was at the bottom of a steep hill at a traffic light, and behind her was this dump truck that lost its brakes, smashed into the back of her car, and killed her. Oh. And that was just devastating. That was just entirely devastating for Jim. They reached a point where he and Paula then moved into the hills of Massachusetts, western Massachusetts, and in the interim, all of Jim's friends, including myself, we began to no longer hear from him. We were, in a way, shut out. And this is, 6 or 7 people. We used to go into New York to the Lion's Head, and we would sit and talk and drink a beer or two. And these were people he was really, really close to. Elliot Asanov, myself, Larry Ritter, 3 or 4 others whose names I just can't think of at the moment. But she managed to separate Jim not only from his children, but from his friends as well. And, off they went. And, Michael and I have remained, close. He lives in Brooklyn. And, we were reminiscing the other day about, Jim, and Michael had gone out of his way. The Yankees, of course, had shunned Jim from coming back to these Old Timers Day games, and Michael had written a really wonderful letter to the New York Times that they published, begging Steinbrenner to invite Jim to Old Timers Day, and they did, which was
he was
very,
brought
very
back into the fold, as it were.
Well, at least he was invited back. Let's put it that way. I think the players, much as when I wrote the book 7, which was a novel about Mickey Mantle, and the players were all upset that I had said that Mickey enjoyed sex, so the players were upset when Bouton said that Mickey enjoyed sex. Never mind the truth of it all. They just felt that
everybody enjoys sex.
Yeah, well,
besides that little thing.
Yeah. So at least Michael did that for Jim, which was very, very nice. But Michael, unfortunately, was barred from visiting his dad and Paula, and Jim never lifted a finger to say otherwise, which I thought was terrible. And then, unfortunately,
was he losing it himself a little bit?
Yeah,
and
about
that
5.
The reason?
Well, no, that wasn't the reason. the reason had to do this enmity that she had for the son, for reasons that I don't understand. I never will understand. But 5-6 years ago, and I don't know why this is, but he at not a terribly old age started to develop,
some sort of dementia.
Some sort of dementia, yeah. Some sort of dementia.
That's what I meant, but I don't know if that had an effect. That may have had an effect on his response to his new wife, or
No. This had happened long before he had dementia. No, that he was basically, she had sort of remade him, had made him over. You were asking me about having Fiat races. He had a little orange Fiat, and I had a little orange Fiat, and we used to love to race on the streets of St. Petersburg. One time when we were both playing for the CBS All-Stars, there was an amusement park down near Atlantic City. I can't remember the name of it. A fabulous amusement park. But one of the things they had down there, they had go-kart racing. And Jim and I decided to go-kart racing. And, of course, the mistake I make is to forget that I'm racing against a professional athlete. These guys are not like you and me. These guys are totally from a different planet. And so we must have raced that course maybe 20 times, and he only won 20 times. And, it's like I was reminded the other day by Robbie Richardson, who was Bobby Richardson's son. While I was doing Dynasty, I went to the Richardson house to interview Bobby. And while I was there, I saw a ping pong table, and I said to Bobby, "Do you play ping pong?" And Bobby said, "Yeah, I play ping pong." I said, "Do you want to play a game of ping pong?" And he said, "Sure, I'll play." And apparently Robbie was there that day. Robbie was about 8 or 9 years old, and he remembers it to this day because Bobby beat me 21-1. It turns out Bobby Richardson was the state ping pong champion of the state of South Carolina. And that's what I mean when you talk about professional athletes. They're not like you and me.
And that's what Bobby Richardson and Tony Kubek were doing, playing ping pong, when the Yankees, I don't think it was Casey that hired them, but
it was George Weiss. George Weiss, who hired private detectives to follow Whitey and Mickey to see what they were, see what everybody.
But Tony Kubek and Bobby Richardson, they followed them as well, and they went to play ping pong. I don't know if you remember on 42nd Street in New York, of course, they had these ping pong, whole rooms of ping pong tables.
I remember it very, very well. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I used to go there all the time. They had ping pong and pool. It was ping pong and pool. And you could play either or both, and it was wonderful. Oh, yeah. No, I know.
And but let's digress a little bit. Bouton was a fun-loving guy.
He was. He was. We had some very, very good times. We had a lot of fun. Yep. We'd play tennis. I mean, he wasn't a natural tennis player, but he played at it.
But being a professional athlete, hand-to-eye coordination.
Oh yeah, no question about it. He was a fine net player. And every once in a while, I'd get a call. Not Fritz, his buddy, Mike Kekich. Mike Kekich would come over to visit Jim, and this was during January or February, and Jim wanted to go into the gymnasium and pitch, and I was the one he recruited to catch him. So I would have a catcher's mask and a catcher's glove, and Jim would throw his knuckleball, and for the most part I could catch that. I mean, it did knuckle, but then when it got to the catcher's position, it didn't do much else, and so I was most of the time able to catch it. But Kekich threw the ball 90-something miles an hour, And in this gym that wasn't terribly lit, I had the job of catching Kekich. And oh boy, that was an interesting experience. But, again, a lot of fun. Who gets an opportunity? When I was at Yankee Stadium researching Dynasty to begin with, Ron, the first DH.
Swoboda?
No, the first DH.
Blumberg.
Ron Bloomberg. Ron Bloomberg would come and say, I need somebody to shag. So Hal Lanier and Bloomberg would go onto the field, and I'd have a glove, and I would stand out there, and my job was to shag the balls and throw them in. And so I started, I was a pretty good softball player, so I would start, 30 or 40 feet in front of the stands, and Bloomberg was a lefty, so he was pulling the ball to right field. And I'd say the first 30 balls went over my head until I finally figured out the way you can catch these things is you put your back right up against the outfield wall, and then you can start catching them. And that's what I did. But again, these people are not like you and me. These are phenomenal athletes.
No question. Hal Lanier was the son of
Max.
One
the
of
son
Mexican,
of Max.
Maxie. He was
Yep.
one of the first Mexican jumping beans.
He was.
Back in the late 40s, early 50s, Sal Magli and Hal Lanier or Maxie Lanier. They were signed, and it was like they were ostracized for a while.
Well, what they did to these people, what they did to those people is really terrible. My Spirit of St. Louis book, I interviewed Max Lanier. He was living in a mobile home park somewhere in the middle of Florida. He had no money. His wife was on. She had to breathe air to live. What happened was the Major League Baseball, when the players were forming a union, decided that anybody who was not in baseball in 1946 could not be in the union. See, this was a union that was started by the owners. So they decided if you were not playing baseball in 1946, you could not be in the union. So there were 7 players who were playing in the Mexican League. None of those guys were allowed to be in the union. At the same time, a lot of the players who played even 20 years, then the war came. The war ended in 45. If they didn't come back and play baseball again, they couldn't be in the union either. So about 800 players never,
no
ever,
exemption for being in the war?
Nope. If you didn't play in 46, you couldn't be in the union. And it was disgraceful. It was absolutely disgraceful. And so Max Lanier never got a pension, never got a penny. At some point, I wrote about this in the New York Times because it was interesting. The Negro League players were getting $10,000 a year. Now, they had never played in the majors, but, they had been kept out of baseball because they were African American. And so baseball did something about the Negro League players. And I wrote an article that basically said,
righteously,
that said, how about these guys? And so they ended up giving these guys $10,000 a year as well, which for a lot of these people, that's the difference between leading a poor life and leading a decent life.
Right.
I was always very, very proud of that. This was around 2000, 2001, something like that. But Max,
I'm very proud of you for doing that. That's terrific.
It was. It really
I can't think of the name of any of the other players involved. I remember,
one of them was a Cuban fella, lovely guy. I interviewed most of them for that article. I just can't think of their either. Yeah, Magli was one of them. Magli certainly was one of them. Yeah.
Yeah, and ironically, Magli. I was going to say, in getting back to Jim Bouton in his book Ball 4, Magli had been coaching. He had been the pitching coach of the Seattle Pilots.
That's right.
And maybe I'm wrong about that, but I don't think so. I know Corsetti had been a coach on that team.
Well, Corsetti was the Yankee coach. Grossetti was the
But
Yankees.
later he went on to be a coach on that Seattle team.
I don't know about that. Grossetti?
Yeah.
Hard to believe Grossetti would ever leave the Yankees. I guess it's possible. At any rate, that's about all I have to say about any of that. I miss Jim. I've missed him for a long time. He was
even when
he
was
friend.
Here was alive.
He was a close friend. We were like brothers. And I was partially responsible for breaking us up, which was bizarre.
This is the second wife's decision, and you basically helped her with what you did.
But if
But it wasn't you; it was all his friends.
No, of course. Yeah. I mean, she was very possessive. She was a person who was very, very possessive. And people who are very possessive don't like competition. And she got rid of the competition. It's not the first person I've ever seen that happen to, especially with second marriages.
And it doesn't have to be a romantic thing. It just could be jealous of the friendship, jealous of the intimacy that he shared with another human being. That's
hard to know. It's very hard to know, and sort of ironic because she was a psychologist, and I would have thought that she would have, maybe acted
sometimes
differently.
The counselors need counseling.
Yeah. Yep, they do. But anyway, Ralphie, this is a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Peter. This was nice reminiscing about your friend and one of the most interesting people in the world.
He was. He was wonderful. He really was. He was a joy to be around.
As are you, my friend. Keep coming back
you're very
to this.
Kind. All righty.
Okay.
You take care. Talk to you soon.
If you're out there listening, keep listening. This is fantastic. Peter Golenbock. I'm Ralph Tyko, Comfortably Zoned Network. We'll be back at you when we can. Adios. The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned Network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.